Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's surprisingly complex and way more than just, having a full fridge food security.
Yeah, food security is a big one. A global issue that touches on pretty much everything, really, from the economy to the environment, healthcare, and even things like social justice.
It's wild how interconnected it all is. So let's start with the basics. What exactly are we talking about when we say food security?
At its core, food security means that everyone has reliable access to enough food. And I'm not just talking about quantity, it's got to be nutritious too. It's about having access to food that meets your dietary needs, keeps you healthy, lets you live an active life.
So it's not just about like stuffing your face with whatever's available. It's about having access to the right kinds of food.
Exactly. And to really grasp that, we need to look at the 6 pillars of food security.
6 pillars, huh? Lay it on me. What are we dealing with here?
Okay, so first up, availability. Is there actually enough food being produced and distributed to meet everyone's needs? This gets affected by tons of factors: how we're using land, weather patterns, even livestock management, and what crops farmers choose to plant.
So, like, if a country gets hit by a massive drought, their food availability is going to plummet, right?
Exactly. Then you've got access, which is all about affordability and how we get food to people. This ties in directly with poverty. Even if there's enough food globally, it doesn't mean anything if people can't afford it.
It's crazy how interconnected it all is. So we could have tons of food, but if people can't buy it, we're still in trouble.
You got it. And that brings us to utilization, how our bodies actually use the food. Things like sanitation, healthcare, and even just basic nutrition education come into play here. Someone might be eating enough, but if they're sick or don't understand nutrition, their body might not be absorbing all the good stuff it needs.
Okay, so we've got availability, access, utilization. We're halfway through the pillars. What about the other three?
Number 4 is stability. Can people consistently get the food they need, even when things go sideways? Think natural disasters, economic crashes, conflicts, anything that can disrupt those food supplies and throw everything off balance.
Yeah, like what's going on in Yemen right now is a terrible example. The conflict there, plus their agriculture basically falling apart, has created this horrible situation where millions of people are facing famine.
Absolutely. Yemen's a tragic example of how conflict can completely derail a country's food security and why that stability pillar is so important.
So 4 down, 2 to go. What else have we got?
We've got agency and sustainability. Agency is all about people having a say in the food they eat and how it's produced. Think supporting local farmers markets, having a voice in agricultural policies, that kind of thing.
So it's about empowering people to shape their own food systems.
Precisely. And lastly, there's sustainability. This is the long game, ensuring our food systems can provide food security and nutrition for future generations without messing up the environment or creating social injustices.
It sounds like a tall order. It's like we need to figure out how to feed everyone without destroying the planet while we're at it, right?
You nailed it. Sustainable farming practices, cutting down on food waste, finding new food sources. These are all parts of the sustainability puzzle.
Okay, so now we've got a grasp on what food security actually means. But what's screwing things up? What are the biggest obstacles in our way?
Well, there's a laundry list of challenges. For starters, there are those sky-high food prices that make it incredibly difficult for many people to afford basic groceries.
Yeah, everyone's feeling the pinch these days. But imagine trying to feed a family when prices are constantly going through the roof.
It's a nightmare. And a whole bunch of factors are feeding into this. Pandemics messing with supply chains, the war in Ukraine disrupting global grain markets, and our dependence on fossil fuels making fertilizer super expensive.
Plus, you have those nasty agricultural diseases that can just wipe out entire crops in no time. It's a farmer's worst nightmare.
Absolutely. And remember EG99, that wheat stem rust. It's a serious threat to global wheat production. And that's just one example of how a single disease can threaten the food security of millions.
So we've got those economic factors, those agricultural vulnerabilities. What about the environment? That's going to be playing a huge role, right?
Oh, absolutely. Environmental degradation is a massive contributor to food insecurity, land degradation, water scarcity, overfishing, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, let's talk about land degradation for a sec. We're just hammering the soil with these intensive farming practices, deforestation, overgrazing, and it's all taking its toll, making the land less fertile, less productive.
It's a vicious cycle. We need to grow more food for a growing population, but the way we're doing it is destroying the land we rely on to grow it.
And then there's water scarcity, which is hitting Africa especially hard.
A major crisis for sure. By 2030, predictions show that up to 250 million people in Africa could be living in areas with extreme water stress, and that's going to lead to mass migrations and make growing food even harder.
It's pretty scary to think about. And don't even get me started on overfishing. We're just sucking the life out of our oceans, which is a direct hit on food security, especially for coastal communities.
It's a complex problem with ripple effects everywhere. Overfishing not only wipes out fish populations, but it throws the whole marine ecosystem out of whack.
Okay, so I've got economic problems, environmental disasters. What else is on this list of things keeping us up at night?
One that often gets overlooked is food loss and waste. It's a massive problem at every stage, from production to consumption.
It's crazy how much food gets tossed out in restaurants, grocery stores, and even in our own homes. It's mind-blowing.
It's ridiculous, right? And the wild part is, if we could reduce food loss and waste, it could significantly improve food security across the board.
This is all starting to feel a little bleak, to be honest. It seems like problem after problem.
I know, it can be overwhelming. But don't worry, we'll get into the solutions a bit later. For now, let's change gears a bit and look at how food insecurity plays out in different countries. We'll start with Singapore.
Singapore, seriously, that tiny island nation. How do they even manage food security?
That's what makes them so interesting. They depend almost entirely on food imports, but have come up with some incredibly clever ways to ensure they have enough to eat.
All right, you've got my attention. Tell me more.
They've got this ambitious 30 by 30 program aiming to produce 30% of their food locally by 2030. And they're doing it with some seriously high-tech stuff, hydroponics and aquaculture.
Hydroponics, isn't that where you grow plants in water? Sounds pretty futuristic.
Exactly. And aquaculture is farming fish and other seafood. Singapore doesn't have a lot of space, so they're figuring out ways to grow up instead of out vertically and in controlled environments. Pretty impressive, right?
So Singapore is showing us that even small nations with limited resources can tackle this head-on. But let's switch gears and look at a country facing very different challenges, the Democratic Republic of Congo.
The DRC is a stark contrast to Singapore. It's a country rich in natural resources, but poverty and conflict have turned food insecurity into a chronic issue there.
Over a third of households in the DRC are facing food insecurity, and in some of the eastern provinces, it's closer to 60%. Those are crazy numbers.
It's a desperate situation, and it's especially concerning that a lot of people there rely on cheap, imported food that's often lacking in nutrition.
So they're stuck in this awful cycle where they can't afford healthy food, leading to health problems, making it even harder to escape poverty and food insecurity.
Exactly. And this isn't just happening in the DRC. We see these same patterns in other countries struggling with food security.
And while we're talking about struggles, we can't forget about Yemen. They're facing a humanitarian crisis on a massive scale.
It's heartbreaking. Years of conflict have crippled their agricultural sector, leaving millions facing famine-like conditions.
Think about this. Over 462,000 Yemeni children are severely malnourished. It's almost too much to comprehend.
Yemen is a tragic reminder of what happens when conflict and food insecurity collide.
All right, I think we need a bit of a break from all this heavy stuff. Let's head back to North America for a minute and talk about Canada. You'd think they'd have it figured out, right?
You would, wouldn't you? But Canada has a pretty serious food insecurity problem, too. Over 4 million Canadians, including 1.2 million children, struggle with food insecurity. And it's not affecting everyone equally.
What do you mean?
While some groups are being hit harder than others, like Indigenous and Black communities, they face higher poverty rates, systemic barriers that make it tougher to get affordable, nutritious food.
That's a really important point. Food insecurity isn't just about individual choices or circumstances. It's tied to social and economic inequality.
You got it. And to tackle food insecurity, we need to address these systemic issues head on.
Now, before we get into solutions, there's one more piece we need to talk about.
Yeah.
Gender and food security.
A crucial aspect for sure. Women are disproportionately affected by food insecurity worldwide. They often have less access to resources and face cultural norms that limit their control over food production and distribution.
That's messed up. We need to do better.
Absolutely. Empowering women is vital if we want to achieve food security for everyone. When women have control over resources and decision-making, their whole communities benefit.
All right, so we've laid out the problems, and they're big ones. But I know there are amazing people and organizations out there working their butts off to make things better.
You're absolutely right. There's a ton of incredible work being done to tackle food insecurity, both in the short term and in the long run.
So let's talk solutions. What are some of the most promising approaches?
The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, has been a key player for decades. They've got this twin-track approach that combines sustainable development with efforts to provide immediate hunger relief.
Sounds like a solid plan. How does that work in practice?
On the sustainable development side, they're focused on things like investing in rural markets and infrastructure, promoting sustainable farming practices, and empowering small-scale farmers.
So it's about building resilient food systems that can handle those shocks
Yeah,
and
wow.
provide for communities in the long term.
Exactly. And for immediate hunger relief, they use various strategies like food aid, distributing vouchers for seeds and fertilizer, and school feeding programs.
Those are all important steps, but it seems like the focus is on governments and those big international organizations. What can regular people like us do to help?
That's a great question, and honestly, there's a lot we can do. One of the biggest things is just being more aware of food waste.
Yeah, we talked about that before, but it's worth repeating. We can all make an effort to reduce food waste in our homes and support businesses trying to minimize their waste.
Absolutely. And we can support local farmers markets and community gardens, which helps build more resilient and sustainable food systems right in our neighborhoods.
Okay, I'm starting to feel a little more hopeful now, but I'm still curious about those alternative diets you mentioned earlier. What's that all about?
Oh, yeah. Now things get interesting. Remember those insects we talked about? Well, they're just one example of an alternative food source that could play a bigger role in tackling food security.
Okay, I'm picturing a plate of roasted crickets. Not exactly my idea of a delicious meal, but I'm trying to keep an open mind. What else is there?
There's algae, which is full of nutrients and can be grown in all sorts of environments. And mycoprotein, a protein derived from fungi, is already being used in some meat alternatives.
So we're talking about foods that are sustainable, nutritious, and can be produced in ways that don't put as much strain on the environment.
That's the idea. These alternative sources could be a game changer, especially as the world's population keeps growing and resources become scarcer.
So are you saying we should all be eating bugs for dinner?
Not necessarily. But it's important to be open to new ideas and different ways of producing and consuming food. The future of food security might look very different from what we're used to.
All right, everyone. That's it for part 1 of our deep dive into food security. We've covered a lot, from the 6 pillars to the challenges and some promising solutions. And don't worry, we'll be back for part 2, where we'll dig even deeper into this crucial issue, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive on food security.
Picking up right where we left off, exploring this whole intricate world of food security. It's kind of like this giant global puzzle where all the pieces are connecting in ways you wouldn't expect.
And we've got a ton more to uncover. Last time we were talking about how some countries, like Singapore, are coming up with these innovative ways to secure their food supply, even with limited space and resources.
Right. Their 30 by 30 program is super ambitious, aiming to produce 30% of their own food locally by 2030. They're using high-tech vertical farms and aquaculture. Kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to food security. Every country has its own unique set of challenges and opportunities to deal with.
Totally. What works for Singapore might not work in a massive country like the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have poverty and conflict as like the biggest drivers of food insecurity there.
The DRC is a good example of how social, economic, and political factors all play a part in food security. It's this complex web, and we see these patterns in countries all over the world.
Yeah, and we talked about how gender inequality is a huge factor in all of this too. Women are essential for food production and household nutrition, but they often face these barriers when it comes to resources and decision-making.
Totally. Empowering women isn't just about fairness. It's a crucial strategy for achieving food security. When women thrive, their whole communities benefit too. It's a no-brainer, really.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the problems. Now let's dig into some solutions. Last time we were talking about the FAO's twin-track approach, right? Combining immediate hunger relief with long-term sustainable development.
That's a solid framework.
Yeah.
But there's this growing awareness that technology can play a big role in tackling these challenges too.
Technology? Are we talking like robot farmers and drones dropping off groceries?
Well, sort of. Precision agriculture is becoming a big thing. It uses sensors and data analytics and automation to optimize crop yields and cut down on how much we're using resources.
So instead of spraying whole fields with pesticides, you can target very specific areas. Which is better for the environment and saves money too.
Exactly. And then there's biotechnology. It's about developing crops that are more resistant to pests and diseases and can withstand those droughts. It's a bit controversial, but it definitely has potential.
That could be huge, especially in regions that are getting hit hard by climate change.
It could be a total game changer. And we can't forget about mobile technology. It's connecting farmers to information, markets, and financial services, helping them make better decisions and improve their livelihoods.
It's amazing how technology can bridge those gaps, especially in remote areas where access to those resources is limited.
It's making a huge difference. And then there are the food processing and storage technologies. They're really important for reducing food loss and waste, which is a big problem we've talked about.
Right. We're talking about things like better packaging, improved storage facilities, even using innovative techniques to preserve food for a longer time.
It all makes a difference. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about trade policies. They have a big impact on global food security.
Trade policies, really? Food security seems to be tied to everything.
It really is. Think about it this way. Trade barriers, things like tariffs and quotas, can make it harder for some countries to get the food they need, especially if they depend on those imports.
And those unfair trade practices can really hurt farmers in developing countries, making it super hard for them to compete in the global market.
Yeah, exactly. Organizations like the World Trade Organization are working on creating a more level playing field, promoting those fair trade practices.
So basically, we need policies that support those small-scale farmers, make sure food can move across borders when needed, and make sure countries don't get screwed over by these unfair trade deals.
Yeah, precisely. Okay, so now let's move on to food aid. It's often considered a lifeline during emergencies, but there's a lot of debate around its effectiveness and, its potential downsides.
Yeah, I can see how it could be a tricky situation. Just dumping a bunch of cheap food into a country might help in the short term, but could also weaken those local markets and even create dependency, right?
It's a valid concern, for sure. There's a growing movement towards food aid that's more sustainable and sourced locally.
So instead of shipping in food from all over the world, you're supporting those local farmers and businesses, which helps build resilience in the long run.
Exactly. It's about empowering communities, not just giving handouts, right?
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive. We've looked at the role of technology, the impact of trade policies, and how complex food aid can be.
We've barely scratched the surface, but one thing's clear. There's no magic bullet, no single solution to food security. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach.
It'll take governments, international organizations, businesses, and individuals all working together. We all have a part to play in this.
And we need to keep the ethics of it all in mind. Food isn't just some commodity, it's a fundamental human right.
Right. We need to make sure that everyone has access to food that's safe, nutritious, and culturally appropriate.
And that leads us to the final part of this deep dive, where we'll explore some of the future trends and challenges and leave you with some food for thought.
Stay tuned for part 3, where we wrap up our journey through this super important issue.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping things up with our exploration of food security. It's been quite a journey, taking us from those high-tech farms in Singapore to the harsh realities in those conflict zones like Yemen and the DRC. It really has been a wild ride. We've covered a lot of ground. Those 6 pillars of food security, those daunting challenges like poverty and conflict and the whole environment going haywire. But the story doesn't end there. There's a whole lot happening on the horizon that we need to talk about.
Yeah, it's like food security is this puzzle that keeps evolving, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of those trends and breakthroughs that are shaping how we think about the future of food?
One that's pretty exciting is the rise of urban agriculture. Cities are getting bigger, populations are booming, and there's this growing awareness that we need to produce food closer to where people actually live.
Yeah, I've seen those rooftop gardens and vertical farms popping up everywhere in cities. It's pretty cool seeing food being grown in these unexpected places.
It's not just about aesthetics, though. Urban agriculture could make food more accessible, create jobs, and even cut down on those transportation costs.
And it could help people connect with their food again, foster a sense of community and make people more aware of where their food's actually coming from.
Exactly. Another trend we're seeing is personalized nutrition. With advances in genetics and technology, we're getting a much better understanding of how our bodies react to different foods.
So instead of following some generic diet plan, you could get personalized recommendations based on your DNA and lifestyle.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty futuristic to me.
You got it. Personalized nutrition could help people make healthier choices, prevent those chronic diseases, and even help with athletic performance.
It feels like we're moving toward a future where food isn't just about survival, but about, like, optimizing our health and well-being, you know?
That's the direction things are headed for sure. And speaking of optimizing, there's this movement towards regenerative agriculture. It's a more holistic approach that focuses on restoring soil health, increasing biodiversity, and just making those ecosystems work better.
So it's about working with nature instead of against it, right? That
Yeah.
sounds way more sustainable than those intensive farming practices that have been trashing the environment for decades.
Yeah, it's a total paradigm shift, and it could actually help pull carbon out of the atmosphere, improve water quality, and make our food systems way more resilient.
Okay, so we've got urban agriculture, personalized nutrition, and regenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
Anything else on your radar? Any other game changers out there?
Well, there's growing interest in those alternative protein sources, like, those plant-based meat alternatives, and yeah, even those insects we talked about earlier.
I knew you were going to bring those bugs back. But seriously, are people really going to start eating, like, crickets and grasshoppers? It seems a little far-fetched, to be honest.
It might take some time for certain cultures to fully embrace insects as a mainstream food, but they're already pretty common in many parts of the world.
And they're packed with protein and nutrients. Plus, they're way more sustainable than traditional livestock. So
Yeah.
maybe we just need to get over that ick factor, right?
Precisely. So whether it's plant-based burgers or cricket flour, the future of protein might look very different from what we're used to.
All right, we've talked about some of the cool trends, but what about the roadblocks? What are some of those big challenges we need to figure out to achieve food security for everyone?
Climate change is a huge one. It's already messing with weather patterns, making those extreme events more frequent, and affecting crop yields. It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, we're talking about droughts, floods, heat waves, all the things that make it harder to grow food. It's like Mother Nature's fighting back, you know.
And it'll only get worse if we don't address climate change head on. We need to invest in those sustainable farming practices, slash those greenhouse gas emissions, and build food systems that are more resilient.
And the world's population is still growing. That's another big challenge, right? We're adding more mouths to feed, putting even more pressure on those resources that are already stretched thin.
Yeah, we need to figure out how to produce more food with less impact on the environment. Embrace those innovative technologies, reduce food waste, explore those alternative food sources. We need to get creative, for sure.
And we can't forget about conflict and political instability, which can disrupt those food supplies and lead to those devastating humanitarian crises. It feels like we're always putting out fires around the world.
Yeah, peace and stability are key for food security. We need to address the root causes of conflict, push for those diplomatic solutions, and ensure that aid reaches those who need it the most.
All right, I think we've covered pretty much everything there is to know about food security. It's been an eye-opening deep dive.
It really has. We've looked at the complexities, the challenges, and the things that give us hope. But the main takeaway here is that food security is something we're all responsible for. We all have a role to play.
Whether it's being more aware of our own food waste at home, supporting our local farmers, or pushing for policies that support sustainable agriculture, each of us can make a difference.
Food's a fundamental human right. It's about more than just filling our bellies. It's about health, well-being, and creating a world where everyone has access to the food they need to thrive.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the world of food security with us. Remember, even small actions can have a big impact. So let's all do our part to build a more food-secure future for everyone. Thanks for listening.